The 17th of January 1945. Lingayen Gulf, Philippine Islands. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stood on the rain-slicked deck of a destroyer disguised as a cargo vessel, watching the eastern horizon bleed orange and crimson as dawn broke over Luzon. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel, thick enough to coat the tongue. Around him, junior officers clutched manifests and tactical reports with trembling hands, their faces hollow from months of inadequate rations. In his palm, Onishi held a crumpled intelligence bulletin, American casualty figures from Leyte Gulf, transcribed by an exhausted signals officer whose handwriting grew shakier with each line. The numbers themselves meant little. What followed meant everything. Beneath those figures, a single line in hastily brushed characters. Estimated American replacement vessels observed in theater. Exceeds total losses by factor of 3. Source reliability, confirmed by multiple reconnaissance flights before loss of aircraft. Onishi read it again, then a third time. The paper grew damp in his grip, whether from the humid air or the cold sweat on his palms, he could not say. Somewhere in the mathematics of that sentence lay an equation that could not be solved by courage, by sacrifice, or by the spirit of Bushido his instructors had venerated since his days at Etajima Naval Academy. It was an equation that spoke of something his education had never prepared him to face, the industrial reality of a nation that could afford to lose and still grow stronger. He folded the paper carefully, as one might fold a death certificate, and placed it in his breast pocket where it rested against his heart like a cold stone. The Japanese understanding of warfare in 1941 had been predicated on a calculated assumption, one shared by military theorists from Berlin to Tokyo, from the war colleges of Heidelberg to the strategy rooms of the Imperial Japanese Naval Staff. Modern industrial warfare, they believed, was a war of attrition, a brutal calculus where the side that bled slower would prevail. The Americans, soft from decades of peacetime prosperity, addicted to comfort and individualism, would lack the spiritual fortitude to endure prolonged suffering. They would count their dead, calculate the cost, and sue for negotiated peace once the butcher's bill grew too steep for a democracy to stomach. This was not mere propaganda. It was founded on careful observation of American history. Had the United States not wavered during the Philippine-American War? Had public opinion not soured on intervention during the Great War's bloodiest campaigns? The Japanese High Command, studying the social fabric of American democracy, concluded that a nation built on the premise of individual happiness could not sustain collective sacrifice. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Harvard-educated and intimately familiar with American industrial capacity, had warned that Japan might run wild for 6 months or a year, but could not win a protracted conflict. His warnings were noted, filed, and largely ignored by a command structure that believed spirit could triumph over steel. What none of them, not Yamamoto with his prescience, not Onishi with his tactical brilliance, not the war planners clustered in their Tokyo offices truly comprehended, was not merely the scale of American production, but its fundamental nature. They understood factories, they understood assembly lines. What they could not fathom was a logistical philosophy so radical, so contrary to every principle of military economy they had studied, that it resembled less a supply chain and more a force of nature. In the summer of 1942, when Japanese forces had stretched their empire from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy could field approximately 10 fleet carriers, the sword edge of modern naval warfare. Each carrier represented years of construction, thousands of skilled workers, and resources carefully husbanded from an island nation perpetually starving for raw materials. The loss of 4 carriers at Midway in June of that year was therefore not merely a tactical defeat, but a material catastrophe. Japan's shipyards, already operating at maximum capacity, might replace those vessels in 2, perhaps 3 years if the steel could be found, if the skilled workers could be spared, if the American submarine campaign did not strangle the flow of oil and bauxite from the conquered southern territories. The United States Navy, by contrast, had begun the war with 7 fleet carriers. By the end of 1942, American shipyards would deliver 8 new Essex-class fleet carriers. In 1943, another 14 would slide down the ways, their hulls still warm from the welding torches. In 1944, 23 more, and alongside these fleet carriers came the escort carriers, smaller, slower, built on merchant hulls with the same industrial philosophy one might apply to manufacturing automobiles. Kaiser Shipbuilding in Vancouver, Washington, would eventually reduce the construction time for an escort carrier to an average of 4 months, 50 days for the fastest. Japanese intelligence officers, receiving these figures from surviving reconnaissance pilots and submarine commanders, initially dismissed them as American propaganda. The numbers were impossible. They violated every principle of naval construction, every understanding of industrial limitation. A nation could not simply conjure aircraft carriers from thin air like a magician producing doves. The steel alone, where did they obtain the steel? The skilled labor, the precision instruments, the 1,000 specialized components that transformed metal into a functioning warship. Surely these were phantom vessels, mock-ups designed to deceive and demoralize. Then the reconnaissance photographs arrived. Grainy images shot from extreme altitude by pilots who knew they were flying suicide missions, unlikely to return. The photographs showed the shipyards of Philadelphia, Norfolk, Mare Island, Puget Sound, and in those photographs, visible even through the distortion of distance and poor quality film, lay carrier after carrier after carrier in various states of completion, their angular forms crowding the shipways like cattle in a feedlot. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and survived the war to become one of Japan's most introspective military historians, would later write, "We had attacked Pearl Harbor believing we were crippling a nation's ability to make war. We had succeeded only in making them angry. What we thought was the American fleet was merely what America kept on hand for convenience. Behind that fleet lay an industrial capacity we had mistaken for mere wealth. We confused abundance with softness, not understanding that abundance itself could be weaponized. The psychological transformation began, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small realizations, accumulated like drops of water that eventually crack stone." For Captain Tamechi Hara, commander of the destroyer Shigure and one of the few Japanese surface commanders to survive the war, the revelation came during the night battle off Cape Esperance in October 1942. His ship had engaged American cruisers in a confused melee of searchlights and torpedo spreads, the kind of close-quarters brawl where Japanese night-fighting doctrine should have prevailed. The Shigure survived. Many vessels on both sides did not. What haunted Hara afterward was not the violence of the engagement, but what he observed in its aftermath. At dawn, as he withdrew his damaged destroyer northward through the slot, he witnessed an American destroyer hull torn by torpedo damage, superstructure blackened by fire being attended by a fleet oiler, a repair ship, and 2 ocean-going tugs. The wounded vessel was being stabilized, prepared for the long journey back to a rear area base where it would be repaired and returned to service. Hara's own ship, though less severely damaged, would make its way to Rabaul, where mechanics would patch it with whatever materials could be scavenged, under constant threat of air attack, with repair crews who had not eaten a proper meal in weeks. The Americans, he realized, could afford to save their broken ships. Japan could barely afford to fuel its functioning ones. This same calculus operated at every level of the war. When a Japanese Oscar fighter was shot down over New Guinea, the pilot, if he survived and was lucky enough to land near friendly forces, might wait days or weeks for recovery, subsisting on emergency rations, at constant risk from Allied patrols or hostile natives. The aircraft itself, representing thousands of hours of skilled labor and increasingly scarce aluminum, was simply written off. There was no capacity for recovery operations, no spare parts to effect repairs, no surplus of aircraft that might justify the risk of a rescue mission. When an American corsair went down in the same region, the response resembled a military operation. Coast watchers would radio the pilot's position. A Catalina flying boat, sometimes escorted by fighters, would risk Japanese fire to effect a rescue. If the aircraft had crashed on land, Marine raider battalions might be dispatched to recover the pilot and, if possible, salvage critical components from the aircraft. The Americans treated their pilots like valuable commodities, not merely because they cherished individual lives, though they did, but because a trained pilot represented a calculable investment of time and resources that the vast American training infrastructure could replace, given time, but preferred not to waste. By 1944, the disparity had grown so extreme it bordered on the surreal. Japanese pilots, undertaking kamikaze missions because Japan could no longer afford the fuel and training time to create skilled aviators, would fly to their deaths in obsolescent aircraft held together by improvised repairs. Meanwhile, American naval aviators flew from climate-controlled ready rooms, briefed using detailed intelligence compiled from coast watchers, submarine reconnaissance, and high-altitude photography. They flew aircraft so reliable that mechanical failure rates had dropped below 5%. If shot down, they carried survival gear that included water purification tablets, emergency rations, fishing kits, signaling mirrors, and waterproof maps, a survival kit that weighed more than some Japanese pilots' total equipment load and represented a logistical philosophy that assumed every life worth saving. The symbolic object that came to represent this disparity in the minds of Japanese soldiers was neither a weapon nor a piece of equipment, but something far more prosaic, the American sea ration. When Japanese forces first overran Allied positions in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies in early 1942, soldiers discovered stockpiles of American food supplies. The canned goods they found meat and beans, fruit cocktail, coffee, sugar, cigarettes, and chocolate seemed less like military rations and more like provisions for a luxury cruise. Japanese infantrymen, whose own rations had been progressively reduced as the war consumed more of Japan's agricultural output, opened these cans with a mixture of wonder and resentment. The portions were enormous. The variety was bewildering. Why did a single day's ration include cigarettes and chocolate? These were luxuries, not necessities. It seemed to confirm everything Japanese propaganda claimed about American decadence. But as the war ground on and Japanese supply lines lengthened to the breaking point, the psychological meaning of those rations shifted. On Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers, reduced to eating grass and bark while suffering from malaria and dysentery, watched American positions through the jungle and smelled food, cooking real food, in quantities that seemed obscene. An officer's diary recovered after the campaign recorded, "The Americans eat 3 times daily. We have not eaten properly in 9 days. How can this be called war? They are not warriors. They are tourists who happen to carry weapons." Yet those tourists were winning. They were advancing. They were healthy while Japanese forces collapsed from malnutrition. The cognitive dissonance was profound. In the Japanese military tradition, suffering was valorized as evidence of spiritual purity. Comfort was weakness. Hardship built character. But what did it mean when the soft, comfortable enemy kept winning? What did it say about the relationship between material superiority and military virtue? By 1944, when American forces recaptured territories lost in 1942, they sometimes discovered Japanese defensive positions, literally built around captured American supply depots. On Saipan, Marines found Japanese command bunkers constructed to protect not tactical positions, but stockpiles of American canned goods, hoarded like treasure. Captured Japanese documents revealed that officers had been severely punished for distributing captured American rations to enlisted men, because it damaged morale. Once soldiers tasted what the enemy ate routinely, the inadequacy of their own provisions became impossible to ignore. The sea ration became more than food. It became evidence of a terrible truth. The Americans were not winning despite their material comfort. They were winning because they could afford material comfort. They had so thoroughly mastered the logistics of industrial warfare that they could ship chocolate and cigarettes to forward combat zones as casually as they shipped bullets. The abundance was not a weakness to exploit, but a strength so overwhelming it redefined the nature of conflict itself. The naval engagements of 1944 transformed Japanese understanding from intellectual recognition to visceral horror. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, called by American pilots the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, illustrated the culmination of logistical superiority translated into tactical dominance. Japanese carrier-based aircraft, launched in desperate attempts to damage the American invasion fleet, were shot down in such numbers that American fighter pilots compared it to sport shooting. Of approximately 373 Japanese carrier aircraft committed to the battle, roughly 330 were destroyed. American losses totaled 123 aircraft, with most of those lost to operational accidents rather than combat. The disparity was not primarily about pilot skill, though American pilots were by this point better trained. It was about the ecosystem of technological and logistical support that surrounded each aircraft. American fighters carried VHF radios that allowed coordinated interception. They were directed to targets by radar systems aboard ships and aircraft. They flew aircraft with engines that had been torture-tested for reliability, armed with weapons that had been zeroed and tested, fueled with carefully refined aviation gasoline that would not foul fuel systems or cause engine knock. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, often flew with radios that functioned intermittently if at all. Engines ran on progressively lower-grade fuel as oil refining capacity was destroyed by submarine interdiction and bombing. Weapons were maintained by armament crews who lacked proper tools and spare parts. Some pilots flew combat missions in aircraft that had been repaired so many times they were essentially composite vessels, assembled from the least damaged components of multiple wrecked planes. The final indignity came in the recovery phase, when American pilots, low on fuel after the extended battle, attempted to return to their carriers after dark, a notoriously dangerous operation. Admiral Mark Mitcher made a decision that would become legendary in naval aviation. He ordered the entire task force to illuminate. Every ship turned on its lights, providing navigation beacons for pilots struggling to find their carriers in the darkness. It was tactically risky. The lights made the fleet visible to any Japanese submarines in the area. But Mitcher calculated that he could afford the risk more easily than he could afford to lose trained pilots to navigational accidents. Of the American aircraft that participated in the battle, approximately 80 were lost attempting to land in darkness or ditched when they ran out of fuel. Of those 80 aircrews, search and rescue operations recovered all but 49 men. Destroyers crisscrossed the waters, picking up downed aviators. The fleet, which should have been fleeing the battle zone to escape submarine attack, instead remained in position through the night to facilitate rescue operations. Japanese commanders, reading intelligence reports of this decision, struggled to comprehend the calculation. Mitcher had risked capital ships, aircraft carriers worth millions of dollars, and thousands of skilled workers' labor to save aircrew. In Japanese naval doctrine, this was precisely backward. Ships were precious and irreplaceable. Men could always be trained. But the Americans had inverted the equation. They had so many ships that they could risk vessels to save human beings. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded the Japanese carriers at the Philippine Sea, would later reflect, "We had been taught that America was a nation of individualists, too concerned with personal survival to sacrifice for the collective good. Then we encountered an enemy that valued individual lives so highly they would risk entire fleets to save single pilots. We could not understand how a nation that cared so much about individuals could be so ruthless in combat. We thought they were soft. They were not soft. They were rich enough to afford kindness, and that richness made them invincible." The logistical philosophy that underpinned this abundance was itself revolutionary, though its architects might not have described it in such terms. American military logistics in World War II operated on a principle that would have seemed wasteful to any conventional military planner: the assumption of redundancy. Rather than calculate minimum necessary supply levels and attempt to deliver precisely those amounts, the approach favored by resource-constrained militaries like Japan's American planners calculated maximum possible demand, and then added substantial buffers. This philosophy produced what appeared to be absurd waste. Forward supply dumps on Pacific islands contained enough ammunition for battles that might never be fought, enough food for units that might never arrive, enough fuel for operations that might be cancelled. When the American island-hopping campaign bypassed certain Japanese strongholds, leaving them to wither on the vine, those bypassed islands were often left with massive supply stockpiles that were simply abandoned. From a resource utilization standpoint, it seemed criminally inefficient, but from an operational standpoint, it was devastatingly effective. American commanders never had to pause operations for lack of supplies. They never had to delay attacks because ammunition had not arrived. They never had to ration fuel or food. This meant American forces could maintain operational tempo indefinitely. They could attack, pause to rest and refit, and immediately attack again, knowing that supply ships were already en route with everything needed for the next operation. The supply ships themselves embodied this philosophy. The American merchant marine, expanded through Liberty ship mass production, represented an approach to maritime logistics that treated cargo vessels as semi-expendable assets. Liberty ships were ugly, relatively slow, and built to minimum acceptable standards. They were designed to last perhaps 5 years under normal conditions. The point was not to build ships that would serve for decades, but to build them so quickly and cheaply that losses from submarine attack, from operational accidents, from simple wear, could be absorbed without compromising the supply chain. By 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships per day. Japanese submarines, even during their brief period of effective operations against American logistics in 1942, could not sink ships faster than American yards could replace them. The mathematics were brutal and absolute. Japan had begun the war with one of the world's most effective submarine forces, but Japanese naval doctrine emphasized using submarines for fleet actions rather than commerce raiding. By the time Japanese planners recognized their error, American anti-submarine warfare had evolved to the point where Japanese submarines became targets rather than threats. The strategic implications were profound. American forces could afford to be wasteful because waste was itself a weapon. When a Marine division landed on a contested beach, the logistical tale behind that division included not merely what the Marines needed, but what they might conceivably need under worst-case scenarios. Ammunition stocks assumed every rifle would fire at maximum rate. Food supplies assumed everyone would eat maximum rations. Medical supplies assumed casualty rates higher than even pessimistic projections. This oversupply meant that when unexpected situations arose, when a battle lasted longer than planned, when a position had to be held beyond the estimated time frame, American forces had the material to adapt. Japanese forces, by contrast, were supplied according to careful calculations of minimum necessity. Ammunition was allocated based on expected consumption rates. Food was rationed precisely. Medical supplies were distributed according to projected casualty figures. This meant that any deviation from the plan created crisis. A battle that lasted 2 weeks instead of 1 week meant soldiers went hungry. A defensive action that consumed ammunition faster than estimated meant units ran out of bullets. The Japanese system demanded perfection in planning. The American system assumed imperfection and compensated through overwhelming redundancy. The human cost of this disparity manifested in ways both statistical and deeply personal. On islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where Japanese forces fought with suicidal determination, the contrast between American and Japanese logistics became visible in the physical condition of the soldiers themselves. American Marines and Army infantry, even after weeks of brutal combat, remained relatively well-nourished, adequately hydrated, and supplied with basic medical care. Japanese defenders, even at the beginning of these battles, were often already malnourished, suffering from diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies and lacking basic medical supplies. When American forces captured Japanese defensive positions, they frequently found hospitals that resembled medieval plague wards. Wounded soldiers lay on the ground without stretchers, without bandages, often without even basic pain relief. Doctors performed amputations with sake as anesthesia. Infections raged untreated because sulfur drugs and the newly developed penicillin, which American medical units possessed in abundance, were unavailable to Japanese forces. Some Japanese medical diaries from late in the war describe using seawater to clean wounds because sterile saline was unavailable. The psychological impact on Japanese soldiers of witnessing the material conditions of captured American positions cannot be overstated. A Japanese lieutenant's diary recovered on Okinawa recorded his inspection of an overrun American aid station. They had plasma for blood transfusions. Plasma! We have not had bandages for weeks. Their wounded were evacuated on stretchers carried by dedicated bearers. Our wounded crawl to the rear or die where they fall. Each American corpse we found carried more medical supplies in personal first aid kits than our entire company possesses. How do we fight this? How do we fight an enemy that can afford to give every single soldier enough medical equipment to stock a field hospital? This material disparity extended even to the dead. American graves registration units followed close behind frontline troops, identifying remains, recording details, preparing bodies for eventual repatriation. Japanese dead, by contrast, were buried hastily if at all, with increasing frequency simply left where they fell, as Japanese forces lacked the manpower to spare for burial details. In the Japanese spiritual tradition, proper treatment of the dead held profound religious significance. The inability to honor the dead as tradition demanded represented not merely logistical failure, but spiritual catastrophe, a visible sign that the very cosmos had turned against Japan. By late 1944, as American forces approached the Japanese home islands, the disparity in logistics had become so extreme it produced a kind of strategic paralysis among Japanese commanders. They could see American strength accumulating in forward bases. They could read intelligence reports documenting the endless flow of ships, aircraft, and supplies. They could calculate with increasing precision the overwhelming force that would eventually be brought against Japan, and they could do absolutely nothing to prevent it. The Japanese naval staff, planning for the defense of Okinawa, drafted multiple scenarios for the coming battle. Every scenario ended in defeat, not because Japanese planners lacked tactical creativity or fighting spirit, but because the mathematical realities of the situation admitted no solution. The Americans could afford to lose 2 ships for every Japanese ship sunk and still achieve absolute victory. They could lose 10 aircraft for every Japanese aircraft destroyed and still dominate the skies. The numbers were so lopsided that Japanese strategic planning essentially devolved into discussions of how to make American victory as costly as possible, with the vague hope that sufficient American casualties might lead to negotiated peace. This hope was itself founded on a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capacity. Japanese planners believed there must be some limit to American willingness to accept casualties, some point at which public opinion would demand an end to the bloodshed. What they failed to grasp was that American logistics had made victory so inevitable, so mathematically certain, that the American public was willing to be extraordinarily patient. Americans could see their sons and brothers returning from the Pacific on a rotating basis, unlike Japanese families who sent their sons off with the expectation of death. The Americans fought a war where survival was the norm, and death the exception. Japan fought a war where death was expected, and survival was the aberration. The Kaiten human torpedoes and kamikaze aircraft that emerged in the war's final year represented less tactical innovations than admissions of logistical bankruptcy. When a nation begins converting its pilots into guided missiles, it is acknowledging that it can no longer afford the fuel and time to train them properly, can no longer afford the aircraft to risk in conventional attacks, can no longer afford anything except the one resource of which it still has surplus: men willing to die. The kamikaze attacks achieved some tactical successes, damaging and sinking American vessels. But for every American ship damaged, 3 more arrived. For every American sailor killed, his position was filled by a trained replacement already en route. The desperation tactics that Japanese propaganda framed as evidence of superior spiritual dedication were, in the eyes of the American Navy, simply confirmation that Japan had run out of options. After the war, when Japanese military officers and historians began the painful process of analyzing their defeat, the logistical dimension emerged as perhaps the most difficult to psychologically process. Tactical failures could be attributed to poor decisions or bad luck. Strategic errors could be blamed on particular commanders. But the logistical disparity represented something more fundamental, an admission that the entire basis of Japanese military thinking had been flawed. Masatake Okumiya, a former Imperial Japanese Navy officer who became a military historian, would write in the 1950 seconds, "We lost the war not on the battlefields but in the shipyards and factories we did not possess. Every battle we won, and we won many, was tactically meaningless, because behind every American loss stood 10 replacements. We could sink their ships and they would send more. We could shoot down their planes and they would send more. We could kill their soldiers and they would send more." It was not war as we understood it. It was arithmetic, and we could not solve the equation. This realization produced a profound identity crisis within the Japanese military culture. If spiritual dedication, tactical skill, and willingness to sacrifice could be overwhelmed by simple material abundance, what did that mean for the values the military had venerated? If an enemy that valued individual comfort could defeat an army that glorified suffering, what did that say about the relationship between virtue and victory? Some Japanese military thinkers retreated into mysticism, arguing that material factors were irrelevant and that Japan had lost because of some spiritual failing, some loss of purity. But the more thoughtful analysts recognized that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. They had believed that war was a test of national character, when in fact it was a test of industrial capacity. They had treated logistics as a support function, when in fact logistics was the foundation upon which everything else rested. American planners, for their part, understood this intuitively from the beginning. When General George Marshall addressed West Point graduates in early 1942, he stated, "The victor in modern war is the side that can deliver the most material to the right place at the right time. Courage and skill matter, but they cannot overcome a 10-to-1 disadvantage in supplies." This was not merely a pragmatic observation, but a philosophy that would reshape American military thinking for generations. The epilogue to this story is written not in surrender documents or casualty figures, but in the quiet calculations that followed the war. When American occupation forces arrived in Japan, they brought with them a level of logistical organization that left Japanese observers stunned. Food for occupation troops arrived on schedule, in such quantities that American commissaries had to discard surplus rations. Construction materials for rebuilding infrastructure appeared seemingly from nowhere. Medical supplies, machinery, spare parts, everything required for a massive occupation and reconstruction effort flowed into Japan with the same overwhelming abundance that had characterized American military operations. A Japanese bureaucrat, tasked with coordinating reconstruction efforts, wrote in his private diary, "I begin to understand now why we lost. It was not a war between armies. It was a war between systems. Their system produces more than it needs, and then produces even more. Our system calculated precisely what was needed and tried to produce exactly that amount. When their system was stressed by war, it produced more. When our system was stressed by war, it collapsed. We were artisans. They were industrialists. We valued perfect efficiency. They valued overwhelming redundancy. In peacetime, their approach seems wasteful. In wartime, it was invincible." The symbol of American abundance, which had been the sea ration during the war, became in peacetime the image of Japanese children accepting chocolate from American soldiers. Photographs of these encounters became famous, reproduced in newspapers around the world. For Japanese who had been taught that Americans were decadent and weak, the sight of occupying soldiers casually distributing luxuries to former enemies was psychologically disorienting. It suggested a nation so wealthy, so unconcerned with scarcity, that it could afford generosity even toward those who had killed its sons. This generosity was not purely altruistic, it served political purposes, helping to shape post-war Japanese attitudes toward the United States. But it was enabled by the same logistical philosophy that had won the war, the assumption that America could produce more than enough for its own needs, and therefore could afford to be generous with the surplus. In a sense, the Marshall Plan and American aid to former enemies was logistics as diplomacy, the weaponization of abundance, transformed into a tool for peace. The larger truth that emerged from this history, the lesson that Vice Admiral Onishi had intuited while holding that crumpled intelligence report in his palm on a rain-slicked destroyer deck, was that World War II had fundamentally redefined the relationship between economics and military power. Previous wars had been won by the side that could endure privation longer, that could squeeze more output from limited resources, that could turn scarcity into a virtue. World War II was won by the side that had eliminated scarcity as a limiting factor. The American system of redundant logistics, of oversupply and waste, of treating material goods as if they were infinite, was not merely a tactical advantage. It was a philosophical statement about the relationship between democracy and power. Authoritarian systems, Japanese and German planners had believed, were more efficient because they could compel sacrifice without worrying about public opinion. Democratic systems, they assumed, were constrained by the need to maintain public support, which meant they could not demand extreme sacrifice from their populations. What actually happened was the opposite. The American democratic system, built on principles of individual rights and free market economics, had created such enormous productive capacity in peacetime that when mobilized for war, it could supply both military and civilian needs simultaneously. Americans in 1944 were not starving to feed their soldiers. They were experiencing rationing but not privation. This meant the home front could sustain war production indefinitely because victory did not require civilian suffering. Japanese civilians, by contrast, were reduced to near starvation levels by 1944, which did not increase military production, but instead undermined it as malnutrition reduced worker productivity. The great irony was that the spiritual dedication Japanese militarism demanded, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the nation, became impossible to sustain precisely because the system demanded so much sacrifice. When soldiers learned their families were starving, when workers collapsed from hunger at their factory posts, when school children were mobilized for war production because adult workers could no longer meet quotas, the spiritual foundation of collective sacrifice eroded. The Americans, who asked for less individual sacrifice because they needed less, received greater collective effort because their system made effort sustainable. This was the equation Onishi had recognized in that moment on the destroyer. Japan had built a military system optimized for sacrifice, only to encounter an enemy whose abundance eliminated the need for sacrifice. It was like preparing for a boxing match, only to discover the opponent had brought a gun. The Americans had not merely outproduced Japan, they had redefined the very nature of the contest. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt itself into an economic power, Japanese industrialists and planners studied American logistics with the intensity of religious scholars analyzing sacred texts. The Japanese post-war economic miracle was built, in part, on lessons learned from defeat. The just-in-time manufacturing systems that would make Japanese automotive and electronics industries globally dominant were, in a sense, the peaceful application of logistical lessons learned through catastrophic failure. But the deeper lesson, the one that extended beyond manufacturing and economics, was about the relationship between values and power. The Americans had won not merely because they had more resources, but because their social system, with all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, had proven more effective at mobilizing those resources than a rigidly hierarchical authoritarian system. The Japanese military had believed that order and discipline would triumph over democratic messiness. Instead, democratic messiness had produced the very abundance and adaptability that authoritarian order could not match. This was perhaps the most bitter pill for Japanese militarists to swallow. The recognition that the soft American system built on individual rights, consumer culture, and what appeared to be wasteful self-indulgence had actually been stronger than the hard Japanese system built on sacrifice, discipline, and collective purpose. The values they had mocked as weaknesses had been sources of strength. The comfort they had scorned as decadence had been the foundation of industrial capacity. The individualism they had condemned as selfish had motivated innovation and productivity. On January 17, 1945, When Vice Admiral Onishi stood on that destroyer deck, holding an intelligence report that documented the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory, he was experiencing more than military defeat. He was witnessing the collapse of an entire worldview, a system of values that had failed not because it was morally wrong, but because it was materially inadequate. The Americans had not proven they were better warriors. The Japanese military record, even in defeat, documented extraordinary courage and skill. The Americans had proven they were better manufacturers, better organizers, better at the unglamorous work of supply chain management and industrial production. In the end, the war was not won by the side with the most fighting spirit, or the most advanced tactics, or even the best weapons. It was won by the side that could ensure every soldier ate breakfast, that could replace lost ships faster than they were sunk, that could treat logistics not as a necessary evil, but as the very foundation of military power. The side that understood, perhaps without fully articulating it, that in industrial warfare abundance itself was the ultimate weapon, more decisive than any battleship, more powerful than any bomber, more profound in its effects than any tactical innovation. The mathematics of abundance had solved the equation. The only question had been whether the warriors would recognize the solution before the arithmetic ground them to dust. Some, like Onishi, recognized it. Most did not, or recognized it too late, and by the time they understood what they were truly fighting, not an army but an industrial system, not a nation but an economic philosophy made manifest, the war was already over, decided not by battles but by shipyards, not by courage but by capacity, not by the will to endure suffering but by the ability to eliminate the need for suffering altogether. The chocolate bars and cigarettes in sea rations, once dismissed as evidence of American decadence, had been the heralds of a new form of warfare, one where comfort was a weapon and logistics was destiny. The Japanese commanders who finally understood this truth understood it too late, standing amid the ruins of cities and the collapse of an empire built on principles that industrial modernity had rendered obsolete. The future belonged not to those who could endure the most, but to those who could produce the most. And in that contest, there had never been any real competition at all.